So what do we do when we go to mix a song and we realize that there's like 170 tracks to it? Now, this doesn't matter if it's a song that you wrote or composed, or if it's a song that you're mixing commercially or for a friend. Either way, it feels completely overwhelming. Where do you start? There are so many choices, and trying to fit all the pieces together can feel like it's impossible. In today's video, I'm going to give you a super simple trick that's going to help you navigate high track count sessions. Hope you're having a wonderful day today. My name is Bobby Balo, and I'm the mixing and mastering engineer at Raytown Productions. This channel is dedicated to helping you make better sounding music without needing to buy expensive gear or unnecessary plugins. If you're new here, welcome. Be sure to hit that subscribe button because I drop new videos every single week, and it's going to help you level up the quality of your music. And to help jumpstart this process, I've put together a guide of my favorite free mixing and mastering plugins that you can have completely free. And these are plugins I use all the time when I'm mixing and mastering music. It has compressors, limiters, clippers, amp sims. I even added drum samples to this thing. It's comprehensive. It's totally free. I know they sound awesome, and I think it's really, really going to help you out. If you're interested in that, there's a link to that download in the description. All right, so I'm just pulling you into a session that I had recently, and I loaded everything up, organized it all, and then started adding in all the tracks, and then it's like, oh my goodness, what's all this? Oh man. And then boom, we're up to 170 tracks, right? How does somebody go about navigating this in a logical way? The biggest thing that I can recommend for anybody when they have an overwhelming session is to make sure that you use groups, okay? So we need to set up and assign buses to the different instrumentation in the song. So, for example, I have put all my drums into a drum folder, which goes to a drum bus. I have all of my different basses are all going to the bass bus, all the different guitar tracks, which we have a whole bunch of different clean, distorted guitars. Those are all going to go to a guitar bus and then organized in a guitar folder. And same with vocals, it's broken into clean, screaming, stack vocals, ambient vocals, and then I have an auxiliary track that has all of like the production elements. So if you have synthesizers or textural pads or sound effects, all these things are going to go into like a synth or like a post-production bus. That way, as you're going through and trying to mix, you can really quickly mute all the unnecessary things that are going on in the mix, okay? So, for example, if we don't want to hear any of the production elements, we just mute the production bus. Now, all of that stuff is out of the way, and it's not distracting us from getting a good balance and then starting our EQ and compression and all that stuff. The next thing that I recommend when trying to navigate really dense sessions is to start with only the most important elements and then mix everything in that order. So for some songs, vocals might be the most important element. For other songs, it might be drums and bass. So typically for anything that has a large groove to the song or it has a lot of power and energy, that's usually like rock and metal or rap and EDM, those kinds of genres. Usually you want to start with the drums and bass. If it's more pop-centric, you might want to focus on dialing the perfect vocal tone first. Then you need to decide what elements are the most important to mix next after you get your foundation set. So in this case, I started with drums and bass, and then I started mixing guitars because it's a rock song. And then I added in the vocals on top of that, got all that dialed in perfectly, to just the way I liked it. And then we deal with all of the extra percussion, all of the extra synthesizers, pads, those things. So for example, there's a whole bunch of synths that are going on. They're all doing different things. And even though they're labeled like main synth, it's still something that I wait to introduce until after I've mixed and locked in all of my fundamental elements, okay? try to resist the urge of doing any EQ to any of these tracks before you've gotten your foundation locked in. And when you're mixing any of these auxiliary tracks, what I recommend is taking every single one of these down to 0 volume, okay? So we want to have it basically muted. So pull that fader all the way back. And then for each element, listen to the song and just increase the volume until you feel like it's about right. And then back it off a tiny bit. And then go on to the next auxiliary percussion thing or next special effect. And the reason I like to do it this way is because you'll know right away when you're turning the volume up if the frequencies of that auxiliary track are clashing with the more important elements. And if they are, that's when you go for grab an EQ, cut some stuff out to make sure that your vocals are still clear, your drums are still punchy, and everything else has its own space. There's going to be a lot of times where you don't need to do anything to these tracks at all. And that's okay. That's not a problem at all. If it's not stepping on any toes anywhere, it doesn't matter. That's totally fine. So if you look, a lot of these, all it is EQ. So rolled off a little bit low energy because it didn't really need that. A little bit of top end, rolled off the low energy. I didn't do anything at all to this track. This synth bass, I just cut a little bit of mids out because I felt like it was stepping on the vocal. One other thing I want to point out when you have a whole bunch of these synths and pads and stuff is to be careful when you use effects. So if you have a lot of reverbs or delays, you can start getting a really muddy mix very fast. And you're going to lose the clarity that you had before you had all those elements in. After you ride that volume fader up and you make any corrections, if it still feels like something's missing, that's when you can consider adding in a little bit of that reverb or delay. Finally, something else I'd recommend if you're working with a bunch of string elements, so like a symphony or you have a string quartet or something like that, sometimes it makes sense just to take all those elements and put them into a single bus. And then instead of EQing any of the individual tracks, just EQ them all together or maybe lightly compress them all together. That way, those elements stay consistent in their tone and it's going to be better represented in the song. The last thing you want to do is to take a group of elements that are supposed to sound like they're in the same room and then process them all differently, put different compressors on them and try different EQ things. You don't want to do any of that. This also works really well if you have large vocal stacks, like in a lot of pop productions. Sometimes I get songs where there's 20 background vocals, and it'd be an absolute nightmare to sit there and try to EQ each track individually, right? So you can just bust them all to a group and then just work on it in the group bus. That way, you just do one EQ move, and it affects all 20 tracks. And sometimes when you have these super large track counts, it's hard for your computer to keep up. So if you've had a problem like that, I know I certainly have. Something that I do is I'll actually bounce down all the tracks that are similar, that have the same sound, like, for example, that string quartet that I just talked about, or those 20 background vocals for that pop song, and you just go and you'll literally just export, let's say, this entire P synth bus as a single stereo wave file. Once you kind of have it balanced the way you want it and pan the way you want it, so that way you don't have to worry about all those little tracks. You just make peace with your initial gut instinct and your panning decisions and you move on. So what that looks like is you just go file and we're going to literally mix down just this section. So in Cubase, I can just choose the P synths bus, and then we're going to import it back into the project as an audio track. And so we just export it, and guess what? All these are going to be consolidated into a single stereo file, and that just took all of these like 11 tracks and condensed it into one. Then you never have to look at all these different tracks and be overwhelmed. All you have now is just this one track. Okay, and then you can effectively just delete these files, and now your session's a lot simpler, and you know that this one track has all those synths, and it's already balanced well, and you're good to go. What's the highest track count song that you've ever had to work with? And how did you manage a session that big? Did you follow the same strategy I used in this video, or do you have one of your own? Be sure to let me know in the comments. Let's get a conversation started. That way we can all learn from each other and then grow as a community together. Don't forget to download that free plugin guide that I put together. There's a link to that download in the description. And with that, I want to thank you so much for your time and attention today, and I hope to see you in another video.